Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and give you the essential knowledge you need for safe, evidence-based nursing practice.
And today we're doing a deep dive into some really crucial material. It's from a medical surgical nursing chapter, focusing specifically on the care of transgender patients.
Yeah, this isn't just abstract information. This knowledge directly impacts patient safety, ethical care right at the bedside.
Absolutely.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We're going to synthesize this complex topic into the key concepts nurses really need to master.
It's about providing compassionate care, definitely, but also about actively working to minimize, the pretty severe healthcare disparities this population faces.
Okay, so to frame our discussion, the chapter highlights two main concepts, right?
Yeah.
They seem really interwoven.
That's right. Patient-centered care and healthcare disparities. You really can't succeed at one without addressing the other.
Makes sense.
And underpinning these, you've got the related concepts of sexuality and reproduction. These inform, well, pretty much all the physiological aspects of care we'll discuss.
Got it. So let's start at the beginning. Terminology. Because getting the language wrong seems like the first hurdle.
It often is. It's fundamental. We absolutely have to be clear on the distinction between gender and sex.
Okay, so sex, that's biological or natal sex, basically the anatomy someone is born with or assigned at birth. Physiological?
Exactly. Just the anatomy. But gender identity, that's completely different.
That's the internal sense of self, right? Whether someone identifies as male, female, maybe both, neither, or something else, like genderqueer.
Precisely. And the critical point is that your gender identity is separate from your reproductive organs. It's an internal sense of being.
And this is where the language gets so important. You mentioned transgender.
Yes, and it's vital to remember. Transgender is an adjective, always. It describes a person whose gender identity doesn't align with their sex assigned at birth.
So you say a transgender patient.
Correct. Never just a transgender. That's considered disrespectful and incorrect.
Okay. And then we have the terms used clinically, like MTF.
Right. MTF stands for male to female. These individuals are often called transwomen. They were assigned male at birth, but identify and live as female.
And the opposite is FTM, female to male, referring to trans men, assigned female at birth, but identify and live as male.
Correct. And when there's that significant distress, that emotional or psychological pain because of the conflict between natal sex and gender identity, that has a clinical term, gender dysphoria.
So gender dysphoria is the distress itself.
Yes, it's the distress that often motivates seeking care.
Okay, so how does this translate into practice? In a busy hospital setting, you're doing a quick assessment. What's the approach?
Well, the gold standard, always, is to ask the patient directly. How do you identify your gender? What name and pronouns do you use?
But sometimes you don't have that chance immediately,
Yeah,
right?
that's the reality. In those moments, the guidance suggests using your clinical judgment. Use pronouns that seem to match the patient's physical presentation, their clothing, their appearance, until you can confirm with them.
It's about showing respect from the get-go.
Exactly. Swift, authentic respect.
And what if you make a mistake? You accidentally use the wrong name or pronoun. It happens.
It does. And the advice is pretty simple. Just self-correct quickly and move on with the conversation.
So no big drawn-out apology.
No, please don't. A long apology just makes it awkward, shifts the focus onto you, and usually makes the patient feel more uncomfortable. Just a quick, sorry, I meant correct name pronoun, and continue.
That makes a lot of sense. But here's a practical challenge. Documentation. Charts often list birth names, legal names, natal sex, because changing IDs can be difficult.
Right. This is a major friction point.
So how do you handle that? You see a chart with a male name, but the patient presents as female, calling them Mr. based on the chart.
It is immediately disrespectful. It signals you haven't actually seen the patient in front of you. It shows you prioritize the chart over the person.
So nurses have to bridge that gap.
We have to be vigilant. We need to use the name and pronouns the patient uses, regardless of what the chart says initially, and work to get the records updated respectfully. It's about preserving dignity.
And that lack of dignity, that lack of safety, leads us right into the next big topic. Healthcare disparities. This population often comes to us already under immense stress.
Oh, absolutely. The stressors are pervasive. We see huge societal issues affecting their health long before they even walk into a clinic or hospital.
Like what specifically?
Well, think about employment discrimination.
Yeah.
About a third report losing a job or being denied a promotion simply because they are transgender. Housing is another big one. 1 in 5 report experiencing homelessness.
1 in 5, wow. And the risk of violence.
It's alarmingly high. 45% said they were physically attacked in the past year. Nearly half experienced sexual assault at some point in their lifetime.
That's staggering.
And it's even worse for some subgroups. MTF individuals, especially trans women of color, face significantly higher rates of both violence and discrimination.
Experiencing that kind of constant threat, that trauma, it must have profound mental health impacts.
It does. You see very high rates of PTSD, depression. But the statistic that every clinician needs to know, needs to really internalize, is this: 40%. 40% of transgender adults reported attempting suicide at least once in their lifetime.
40%.
Oh.
Let's just pause on that. 40. That fundamentally changes how we need to approach every interaction, doesn't it? Psychological safety becomes priority number one.
It absolutely raises the stakes for every single health history, every assessment. And then when they do try to access care, they hit more barriers.
Like lack of insurance, often tied to that job discrimination.
Yes, but also fear. Fear of discrimination within the healthcare setting and, frankly, a lack of provider knowledge.
I've heard that. The finding that a third of transgender adults had a negative experience with a primary care provider in the last year alone.
It's a huge problem. A major concern is that providers just don't understand the transgender experience. Sometimes patients feel like they have to educate their own doctors, basically acting as their own experts.
Which makes people reluctant to seek care, obviously.
Exactly, which is why institutional safety is so critical. It's not just a nice to have. The Joint Commission, TJC, has clear recommendations.
What kind of things are they recommending?
Visible, concrete actions. Posting the patient's Bill of Rights prominently, having designated unisex or all-gender restroom.
Practical things.
Yes, and making sure intake forms use gender-neutral language, like using partnered instead of just offering married, single, divorced, avoiding assumptions about relationships or family structures.
And those visible safe zone signs you sometimes see, like the rainbow flag or the pink triangle.
Those are important signals. They're not just decoration. They tell patients, this space is intended to be safe and knowledgeable for you. It can immediately help reduce some of that fear they carry in.
Okay, so let's shift to interventions. When we're taking a health history, we need to ask about any transition-related steps, right? Therapy, surgery, hormones.
Definitely. And it's crucial to ask specifically about hormone therapy obtained from non-medical sources like the internet or what's sometimes called gray market pharmacies.
Why is that specific question so important, even if they seem okay now?
Because self-medicating without medical supervision dramatically increases risks, serious risks. Things like hepatitis C from sharing needles or dangerous complications from unregulated silicone fillers if they're trying to augment their appearance. We need to know for safety.
Right, so we can plan care appropriately. Now, for professionally managed hormone therapy, there are standards, aren't there? WPATH.
Yes, WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, they set the global standards of care. These aren't just hospital policies, they're the ethical and safety benchmark for starting hormones.
And what are those criteria generally?
Generally, it includes having continuing, well-documented gender dysphoria. The person must have the capacity to give informed consent. They typically need to be 18 or older. And any existing medical or significant mental health issues need to be reasonably well controlled.
Okay, let's break down the therapies. Starting with MTF, or feminizing therapy, that usually involves estrogen.
Yes, estrogen therapy, often combined with medications that reduce androgens, male hormones. The most common anti-androgen used is spironolactone.
And how is the estrogen typically given?
The preferred routes are transdermal, like patches or injectable. Oral estrogen is used less often.
Why is that?
Because oral estrogen carries a significantly higher risk of VTE, venous thromboembolism, blood clots, like DVT or PE. That's a major safety concern.
Okay, so transdermal or injectable is safer from a VTE perspective. What changes should patients expect?
The expected physical changes include breast tissue development, some decrease in muscle mass, softer skin, decreased testicular size, and often reduced erectile function and libido. The text usually has a table 68.2, listing these.
And nursing safety priorities. Besides the VTE risk with estrogen, you mentioned spironolactone.
Right. Spironolactone is key here. It's a potassium-sparing diuretic. So while we expect it to help lower blood pressure, maybe cause some increased urination, the critical thing to monitor is potassium levels.
Hyperkalemia risk.
Exactly. Periodic lab testing is essential because high potassium can lead to dangerous heart rhythm problems, cardiac dysrhythmias. And for patients who might already face barriers to getting regular follow-up labs, this needs extra attention.
Got it. Now let's switch to FTM, or masculinizing therapy. That's primarily testosterone.
Yes, testosterone therapy. It's usually given as an injection intramuscularly or topically with gels or patches. Oral testosterone is actually the least effective option.
And the expected changes here, again, table 68.3 in the text, probably lists these.
Correct. You'd expect things like voice deepening, growth of body and facial hair, increased muscle mass, often an increased libido, and typically the cessation of menstrual periods.
Okay, what are the major safety concerns or complications with testosterone?
The big ones are cardiovascular and metabolic. Before starting testosterone, patients absolutely must be screened for existing liver and heart disease
Why is that?
because testosterone therapy can significantly alter their risk profile. It tends to increase LDL, the bad cholesterol, while decreasing HDL, the good cholesterol. It can also raise blood glucose levels.
So increased risk for diabetes, heart disease, stroke down the line.
Potentially, yes. This means long-term monitoring is crucial. It's not just about checking labs once. It's about educating the patient on the need for consistent, ongoing monitoring of cholesterol, blood sugar, and liver function.
And if they're using injectable testosterone?
Then the critical teaching point, again, is needle safety. Never share needles. That prevents the transmission of bloodborne diseases like hepatitis C or HIV.
Okay, that covers hormone therapy. Let's talk about surgical management, GS, gender-affirming surgery.
Right. And it's important to state upfront that GAS is a very complex, often very expensive, multi-stage option. Many transgender individuals are perfectly satisfied with their transition through hormones and social changes and choose not to pursue major surgery.
It's not a required step for everyone.
Uh,
But for those considering it, especially genital surgery, there are specific criteria, similar to hormones.
Yes, the criteria reflect how significant these surgeries are. Generally, for genital surgeries like vaginoplasty or phalloplasty, WPATH guidelines require things like 12 continuous months of hormone therapy consistent with their gender identity.
Okay.
Usually one or sometimes two referrals from qualified mental health professionals confirming readiness. And crucially, 12 continuous months of living successfully in the gender role that aligns with their identity, real life experience.
And there's a medication adjustment need before surgery.
Yes, this is critical for safety. Patients must stop taking their hormone therapy, usually estrogen or testosterone, at least 2 weeks before the surgery. This is mainly to reduce the risk of blood clots, VTE, during and after the operation.
Makes sense. Let's focus on MTF feminizing surgeries first, specifically vaginoplasty, creating a neovagina. What's unique about the prep for that?
Well, beyond the standard pre-op medical workup, there might be specific requirements like permanent hair removal in the genital area, depending on the surgical technique. And there's usually a very thorough bowel preparation, often involving dehydration, because it's pelvic surgery near the rectum.
Okay. And blood loss is expected.
Yes, significant blood loss can occur. So ensuring the patient has adequate hemoglobin and hematocrit levels beforehand is non-negotiable. Sometimes they might even receive treatments like epoetin alpha or even testosterone with iron injections pre-op to boost their red blood cell count.
Interesting use of testosterone there pre-op. Okay,
Mhm.
post-operatively. What are the immediate nursing priorities after vaginoplasty?
Standard post-op care, of course, like monitoring vital signs, pain management. A specific comfort measure is applying ice packs to the perineum, usually 20 minutes on, then off, every hour for the first week or so to reduce pain and bruising.
But what's the big safety alert here?
The biggest immediate risk highlighted is related to positioning during the long surgery. They're in the lithotomy position, legs up in stirrups, for hours. This puts them at high risk for nerve damage and, critically, compartment syndrome in the lower extremities.
So constant neurovascular checks are essential. Pulses, color, sensation, movement in the legs and feet.
Absolutely crucial. Missing compartment syndrome can lead to permanent disability or limb loss.
And the recovery itself, there's usually packing or a dilator involved.
Yes. Patients are often on bed rest for maybe 4 to 5 days post-op. The neovagina will have gauze packing or a special dilator in place to maintain its shape and depth. Because of this immobility, they'll need VTE prevention, usually with fractionated heparin injections.
And discharge teaching must be intense.
Extremely. They need meticulous instruction on how to use the vaginal dilators regularly. It's a strict protocol they have to follow for months to prevent the neovagina from closing or shrinking. Plus, activity restrictions. No baths for about 8 weeks, no heavy lifting or strenuous activity for around 6 weeks.
And the text usually lists the most serious potential complications we need to watch for. Table 68.4 maybe?
Yes, the most serious ones that need immediate reporting are things like a vaginal rectal fistula, an opening between the vagina and rectum rectal perforation during surgery, and that lower extremity compartment syndrome we already mentioned.
Okay. Now, briefly on the FTM masculinizing surgeries, phalloplasty, creating a penis, seems particularly complex.
It is. The source material really emphasizes that phalloplasties are among the most technically difficult reconstructive surgeries performed. They often require multiple stages over a long period.
And the outcomes.
Unfortunately, the complication rates are quite high compared to other reconstructive surgeries. Things like urethral complications, strictures, fistulas, problems with the donor graft site, scarring, sometimes even rectal injury. This high complexity and complication rate can sometimes lead to patient dissatisfaction.
Which probably explains why many FTM individuals might opt for chest surgery, like bilateral mastectomy and maybe hysterectomy and BSO, but choose not to proceed with phalloplasty.
Exactly. It's a very individual decision based on goals, risk tolerance, and resources.
So, moving beyond the acute surgical phase, what about long-term management and preventive care?
This is vital. For anyone on long-term hormone therapy, ongoing follow-up is essential to monitor for those potential cardiovascular and metabolic side effects we discussed, lipids, blood sugar, liver function.
And prevented health screenings. This seems like an area where things could get missed if we're not careful.
Absolutely. Clinicians have to think about the anatomy the patient still has, regardless of their gender identity or surgical history.
So for MTF patients,
If they haven't had their prostate removed, which is rare, they still have a prostate gland. So they need prostate cancer screenings according to standard guidelines. And if they've had breast augmentation, they need mammograms to screen that breast tissue.
okay, and for FTM patients.
If they haven't had a hysterectomy and removal of their ovaries and fallopian tubes, a BSO, they are still at risk for cervical and potentially ovarian cancer. They need ongoing gynecologic care, including pap smears if they still have a cervix. And if they haven't had a mastectomy, they still need mammograms.
It requires really individualized care planning.
Completely. You also have specific urogenital concerns. FTM patients who haven't had a vaginectomy might experience vaginal atrophy, dryness, itching, discomfort due to testosterone, which needs specific GYN management.
And MTF patients post-vaginoplasty.
They have a significantly shortened urethra due to the surgery, which puts them at a much higher risk for urinary tract infections, UTIs, and sometimes urinary incontinence. So teaching good hygiene and encouraging prompt treatment for UTI symptoms is a key nursing role.
Finally, collaboration seems key for long-term success.
Absolutely. Nurses should be ready to collaborate with case managers, social workers, and refer patients to knowledgeable community resources. Organizations like WPATH, the National Coalition for LGBT Health, or major centers like the UCSF Center of Excellence for Transgender Health can provide ongoing support and specialized information.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the core takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the main message is that truly culturally competent care for transgender patients means seeing each person as an individual. It means prioritizing their dignity in every single interaction and proactively working to recognize and, importantly, mitigate the huge health disparities they face, both societally and within our healthcare systems.
And here's maybe a final thought to leave with our listeners, something that really struck me from the material. Given those incredibly high rates of mental health crises, the violence, the trauma, the 40% suicide statistic just echoes the nurse's role here, often goes way beyond just the physiological. You become an essential advocate. An advocate for basic safety and respect, often within a system that might feel cold or unwelcoming to them. And that advocacy, that fundamental cultural competence, it really starts with something as simple yet as profound as using the correct name and pronouns.
That really is the essence of patient-centered care, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Thank you for joining us for this really essential deep dive today. We hope you'll continue to explore these concepts on your own. Mastering this material isn't just about knowledge, it's about providing safer, more humane care. We'll see you next time.